When we want to find solutions, critical thinking is essential. It's problem solving by thinking outside of the box.
It's a new way of learning, and it's the wave of the future.
It's not your traditional educational experience anymore. You walk into classrooms and they're noisy and kids are engaged and they are taking on real problems in their own community and solving them.
They had an opportunity to come together with Mayor Ginther, and he came to them to problem solve and to really think about some of the big issues that are happening in the city and how can we solve them.
If we can keep that passion going, if we can keep the vision going for these children, then they're going to be able to tackle really whatever comes their way in the future. I get really excited when I think about that.
We guide our children to have independent thinking, critical thinking. They can analyze the information. They can think about what's right, what's wrong.
It's connecting the classroom to the community and making our students active change agents.
A large part is our students' attitude. It's how they approach challenges and overcome them. Challenges don't have to be scary or uncomfortable. They can be exciting and rewarding to overcome.
We're always learning things new about science.
I wrote a 20-page research paper, and I enjoyed it. Now that I'm looking back at it, I really enjoyed the entire process, because in the end, I opened my paper and I was oh my God, I really wrote this entire 20-page paper. And at first I thought it was gonna be super hard, but just thinking about the process, I fell in love with writing.
And it can be hard to problem solve. So I think that kind of imagining what it might look like and then putting that into real life can really help.
But if you make a mistake, it's okay, because mistakes is easy. You can kind of fix it.
There is a real commitment to push them and encourage them and find that niche, find that area that really encourages those students to move forward, to try things, to make mistakes, but to get back up and learn how to do that successfully.
We also want our students to apply critical thinking to themselves. What goals do they have? What do they want to do when they graduate? By thinking about their future early, our students start the process of considering who they aspire to be, beginning in pre-K, and that's exciting.
And so we're looking to really emphasize the idea of Porch River graduate starting cradle and ending career.
Having long-term goals and short-term goals help them to realize what is your ultimate purpose, to learn as much as you can to graduate so you can go on to college and whatever else you choose to do, so that you will be ready for the world and you'll be successful with whatever you choose.
That helps them grow as people, because then they can see the world through a more critical lens.
When we think about creativity, we're talking about students using their imagination to build something of value. And when our students learn with creativity at the forefront, it opens doors to new ways of approaching challenges.
I just got chills, because in all my years in the district, we have not had this level of support for this pathway of learning that speaks to the whole child. Expression in the arts is something that we encourage. Our students have many opportunities to participate in concerts with the bands, strings, orchestra, art exhibitions.
And what's exciting about this attribute is that creativity isn't limited to the arts. It's applicable to everything our students do.
Creativity is about how you think. It's about freedom. It's freedom to challenge the norm.
Everybody's creative in their own way. I feel like even if you don't think you're creative, trust me, you're creative. It kind of relates to being unique to me, because everybody's unique.
I like being creative. I love mixing colors and stuff. I like to be creative because usually I wouldn't show my talents because I'm always shy.
Creativity actually helps a lot with studying. If you're not creative, you're going to copy other people.
And that's the key. We want our students to come up with their own ideas and their own ways of learning, to understand what methods work best for them.
I'm curious, which means I just keep wanting to learn more and more and more and more.
That's where innovation is going to come from. Not from, the folks who've been doing it the same way for the last 30 or 40 years. It is going to come from the newer generation.
How do we set them up? We give them the tools that they need to be able to do whatever it is in life that they want to do.
We have the Adobe suite of products at our disposal now for our students to use at schools and at home to unleash their creativity. I'm so happy we're able to provide the tools finally now so that they can go and unleash it.
When our students use their creativity to build something of value, there's no limit to what we want them to create. It could be artwork, a dance performance, a new business or a new idea, a club or a movement. Value is defined not by who you are, but by who you impact.
It's propelling our students to what's next.
We have to make sure that we open up the doors for creativity. Don't try and change their trajectory. Allow them to be creative, allow them to discover the world.
And that's the power of being a creative person, a creative thinker. I know I can do anything I put my mind to. And I love being who I am.
At the end of the day, the question is why? Why go to all this trouble? Why make changes? Why take a new direction? The answer is simple: love. We are doing this for the love of learning, the love of teaching, love for our students.
One of the, I think, amazing things that have come out of this process is this idea that we will never be normal again, right? We have pushed through to a space of innovation, and we want to keep that and harness that energy.
What has not changed is the dedication and the drive. I mean, that is really why we're here.
What gets me up every morning is the love of students.
We are all about the kids. We put our lives on the line for the kids.
I knew I love you, I love you, I love every single one of you, and I have to continue doing what I'm doing to make sure that you have those opportunities to be successful.
So I feel like that's what created my love for learning, is because I was really close with my teachers and my principals and all of that stuff.
I know she knows that she built me, and I'm always grateful for that.
When I grow up, I want to be a teacher so I can teach.
And when you spend time with children, you see potentials and you see the future and you want the best for them.
Our children, our students are always, always the center. And that is what Portrait is helping us do, to keep them the center and define what that looks like.
This is much more than just words on a page. It is a new day. Now is the time to put these words into action for our students, for our community, for us.
It is hard to get that synergy going, where your partners are also hand in hand with you with the same goals, and that we have in Columbus. We're blessed to have that in Columbus.
Now we have the board that will back her up and continue to push and really get us where we need to be so we can be a model of urban education.
At a time when COVID-19 has upended school years and transformed what learning is, how it feels, and what it looks like, I need you to know your graduation is important because we need you.
Yes, this year was tough, but you have proven to us that you're tougher.
Columbus City Schools has gone on to graduate students from Harvard, from Spelman, from Morehouse, from Duke, from OSU.
These students are the future of Columbus.
When people thought that we couldn't, when people said that we wouldn't, we did.
In Columbus City Schools, Portrait of a Graduate is the cornerstone to ensuring our graduates are well equipped to thrive, not only globally, but right here in Central Ohio.
Our work is just beginning, and we look forward to taking this journey together. Our first attribute for our students is adaptability. Simply put, we want our students to both accept and thrive in a changing world.
One of the things is that the landscape is changing, and as the landscape changes, we have to make sure that we are preparing ourselves and our students.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's August 12th Finance and Accountability Committee, or Appropriations Committee meeting. I'm Michael Cole, and excited to have you all here. Today we have a pretty busy agenda today. We're going to do some discussion definitely around our 5-year forecast. We're going to, of course, convene the minutes, approve the minutes, do our monthly financial report, and have our 5-year forecast discussion and adjourn. So let's get started, if we can, with roll call.
Board President Adair.
Present.
Board Member Brown. Board Member Cole.
Present.
Mr. Green.
Here.
Ms. Johnson. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Miller.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, sir. And is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
All right, there's motion and second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Moving forward, we will get right into our monthly financial report. Treasurer Hort.
Thank you, Chair Cole. This is the monthly report for September, the third month in the fiscal year. On a year-to-date basis, revenues stand now about $19.6 million above plan. In the month of September, they ran about $1.4 million above plan. Expenditures year-to-date at $24.2 million above plan, and for the month, they ran actually about $5.4 million under plan. On a year-to-date basis, that's a 5% variance in revenues against plan, and expenditures are 9% below plan. That leads to a little jump in cash balance that stood at almost $439 million, about $44 million above plan. Getting into the revenue detail, property taxes, minimal activity this month, 34,000 came in there. Just that's very minimal activity. But they remain pretty much at 1.9 million below plan. If you note, down in the other revenue sources, property tax allocation. Those two are very related. Property tax allocation is the homestead and rollback and homestead exemption that we get through the state. And that's just 900,000 below plan. So when you combine the two of them, they're about $1 million off of plan, and that's a 0.27% variance. So we're real close on that, trying to figure out which settlement period is going to be what here. So that's very good there. State aid's running about 208,000 below plan. We actually, on a month-to-date basis, got the first payment of casino money. So it's earlier. We're planning on it for a later month. So while it looks very, very close, it was just because that money came in a little bit earlier. I failed to introduce some people here at the table because I will be calling them on them, which I'm going to do right now to see if he knows how much that casino revenue receipt was. This is Matthew Cordes, our data verification analyst, and here lately he's been actually doing the data prep for all of these reports and has been integral in what we're going to talk about later, a 5-year forecast. So some of the detail I don't know, I'm going to casually look over here and expect him to chime in as I do Eric, and then Terry down there, our executive director for budget. So do you know what the casino was?
I believe it was $1.7 million. I'd have to find that line exact.
And I think in the forecast or the plan, we usually put about $2.5 million in. So it's in the ball, $1.4 million. So it's in the ballpark. So it came in earlier than what we anticipated. Let's go on and take a look at the other revenues. And you'll see that we still haven't received the federal Q-Scooby reimbursement. I think we're at least 3 behind. We're still waiting for the feds to catch up on that for us. And those are in that $250,000 per payment. We usually get 2, so about $500,000 a year. So we're behind there. On the other revenues, the second bar from the right, you can see that that's where most of the variance in this report lie, and quite frankly, that has a lot to do with the pilot payments coming in. I'm looking at Medicaid reimbursement and indirect cost. They're about $5.6 million above plan year to date, and one of those payments was a catch-up from last year. So a lot of timing issues going on there, but the significant one really for us in the long term is the pilots, because that's going to go away. And they were still catching up to meet that July deadline for funding. Other financing sources below plan, about $2.9 million, and that's because the transfer for bus debt service hasn't been posted yet. It was approved, but due to my personal error in putting in the dollar amount, we were off, and that's going to be approved as a correction next board meeting, and then we'll get that entered. So that's a timing issue. Did you get the time?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right. This is an explanation of the other revenues. As you can see, of that $25.6 million variance, $20 million of it is due to pilots, and then that $5.5 million on the Medicaid reimbursement coming in a little bit ahead of schedule. On the expenditure side, again, total expenditures are $24.2 million below. The vast majority of that is due to personnel. We've been trying to take a look at that. Two contributors to that variance. One is planned construction. We looked for the three pay months, and then we kind of flatlined the other months, which meant we more front-end loaded the plan for the first quarter than probably historically we should have. So part of it's plan design. The other issue is there are a lot of openings still. So when we do the plan and we look at whether it's a staffing plan or just what we did last year that we're going to do again this year, we're assuming that everybody's on board from day one. Well, as you know, what are we, 100 bus drivers short right now, something like that. So we're planning on everybody being there day one. That, in fact, is not happening, and we believe that contributes to this under-plan variance. So we may catch up a bit, maybe not make it all up, but the plan will start to kick in the second quarter in terms of them coming together. And I think did that advance? I've lost my ability to advance. There it is. Okay, there we go. This is an explanation of, this is the personal services. I'm really behind. There we go, personal services. That gives you a good idea. The blue line is the plan, the gray line is last year, and the orange is this year. So while we're running under plan, it's behaving as we expected. You can see we hit the 3 pay month. But you can also see that relative to last year, the plan was really significantly higher in that first 2 months. Look out there in December, January, and February, how they get closer. So I think it was our spread that has caused, at least been a contributor to that variance in the front months. And then on the benefit side, same thing applies, smaller dollar amount, but the same thing applies to the benefit side of the equation. Getting into all other expenditures, you can see that once again, the non-personnel areas, as they have typically in the past, are running all under plan. $3.3 million on purchase services, $2.6 million for supplies and material, and capital outlay fairly close, but $775,000 under plan. Lastly, looking at the comparison this year versus last year, you can see that on the left-hand side, the relationship between revenue and expenditures this year is very similar to the relationship last year, in that we build cash balance typically at this time of the year after we get property taxes in, and we'll spend down that cash balance to December until we get into property tax collections again in January, build a balance, and then spend it down towards June. Comparing revenues in comparison to last year, revenues were up about 116 total in $160 million in total, $9 million in state aid, and $26 million in other local, and then $80 million in other financing sources, and that's the return of the advance that we did at the end of the fiscal year to ESSER. Well, it comes back to us, so it's a temporary advance out in 1 year and advance back in the other. So that's why it appears that we're up there, because that advance in didn't occur in 22. On the expenditure side, about a $67.5 million total difference, $30 million in personnel, and then 36.6 in the transfer out for capital funding, because that wasn't in the original plan for this year. So it's those two that explain that year to date. So that concludes my portion of the report for September. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them relative to the September results.
Are there any questions, committee? I just have one quick one about that one aberration that you explained that was tied to transportation. Is this something that was it 20 million? I can't remember what I saw. It's about 3 slides prior. I think it was a personnel piece. But
the personnel piece, yeah.
It was tied, wasn't it tied to transportation?
Well, I haven't really delved into what positions aren't filled at this point in time, but I'm pretty sure I've heard that we're short on bus drivers.
And safety and security too is a big group.
So we're assuming that, staffing that we had in previous years is carried forward to this year, and if we're behind that number, that's part of it. We don't allow for any vagaries and people leaving and people starting. We assume that you start with a full complement. When you don't, that contributes. What degree to that is, I don't really know, but it's that plus plan design.
Thank you. All right. Since there are no questions, moving forward, we'll go to the 5-year forecast.
Okay, thank you. This is the 5-year forecast for November. It'll be presented here, then discussed here. Then 2 weeks from now, when the board meets, it would have been next week, but the board's delayed the meeting until the week following. I'll present it to the Board of Education, which is really a little bit earlier than what we normally do. And typically present it to the board first meeting in November, and then they approve it the second meeting in November. I jumped that up to the second meeting in October, which is now 2 weeks away, primarily because when you see the results of this, there needs to be some additional discussion. And I want to provide board the time to see the report, hear my presentation, and digest it, and then give me some feedback. Because even though I'm presenting you the draft of this report, there may be some changes that you want to, I'm actually going to ask about changes that you want to make to the assumptions to impact the picture of this forecast. Usually when I start the forecast, as you well know, I go over the statutory, I've got several slides at the very beginning. The statutory requirements, and you all know that we have to do this in November and then update it in May, or update it anytime there's a significant change. So I've left those out because we need to get into the meat of this. There's also some clever quips about the vagaries and difficulties of doing a forecast. After preparing this, I didn't feel quite as jolly as I normally do when I do a forecast. So I left that part out because we need to move right into what the forecast looked like and what it's based on. So the forecast that I presented to you, in the agenda and we're discussing today, here are some of the major assumptions on revenues. First and foremost, decreasing state aid. For a long time, we were on the cap. And so students could come, students could go. State aid didn't change because our amount was capped by virtue of how that formula worked, the old formula. We have a new formula now, and we're on the formula, which means the students come and go. The formula changes, and our amount changes. We have a couple of things going on. First, this new formula was to be phased in over 6 years, 16% a year, roughly, a third and a third, a third over 3 bienniums. We've only got one of those. So we're not counting right now on the General Assembly to fund the other 2. That's an assumption. We can talk about that. So in this preparation, I assume no new funding. However, because we have a pattern of declining enrollment, there's kind of a double whammy on that. State share is really the residual of kind of 1 minus local share, if I say that correctly. So they compute local share essentially based upon your wealth. How do they define wealth? It's a ratio. You look at assessed valuation, property valuation, and federal AGI, adjusted gross income, and divide it by the number of students. Well, when AGI and property value go up in the numerator and the number of students goes down, that local share expectation gets larger and your state share expectation goes down. I think the most recent one I saw, which was probably 2 months ago, Matt told me that we went from like 32% to 29%. So what happens in the multiplication later on in the formula is that there's a dollar amount for a certain line item times your number of students in that category. So the number of students is going down, so that beginning number is lower. And then they multiply it by the state share, and that's getting lower. So enrollment causes it's two factors in that decline. So that's why we're projecting falling or decreasing state aid over the life of this forecast. While we can't really argue about the calculation of enrollment and AV and AGI and state share and local share, because that's baked into the formula, we can have a discussion about what you want to assume about the phase-in. The state will begin to discuss its next biennial budget in February, March, and we'll begin to hear about that. It'll be in time to adjust the May, depending upon what we know, but we can talk about what you want to assume here. And I've got some scenarios at the end to give you an idea of what impact that will have. As you may be aware, we have been notified of some penalties that came out of the last budget bill relative to transportation noncompliance. What is deemed noncompliance I won't bore you with, but there have been complaints filed. We've redeemed noncompliant. A penalty has been imposed. We, however, filed a lawsuit against ODE and obtained an injunction, so those deductions are not being made, but the penalty still looms out there, at least for the 22 school year. I've been receiving other notifications from ODE of additional complaints during 23, so depending upon the outcome of the case and anything else that kind of gets worked out relative to this transportation penalty, either the calculation or the penalty itself, this may or may not become a reality. However, for this forecast, I have included a transportation penalty in each year in the amount of $15 million a year. Our total transportation subsidy is close to $30 million. That's the limit that they could deduct, but we would have to be non-compliant for 180 days of the school year. That's, I believe, highly unlikely, but that's the max. As I said, I think I mentioned the penalty for 22 is in that $11 to $12 million range that's being held in abeyance. So I thought 15 seemed like a reasonable round number to put in. We can talk about whether you want to include it or not include it as we get further in this discussion. The other thing that's in here are the end-of-year advances, and that's just $79 million in ESSER-related advances. They go out 1 year, they come back, they do that for 3 years in a row, and in essence, by the end of that time period, they are cash balance neutral to the general fund, but you'll see it causes a bit of an aberration in both the expenditure side and the revenue side. And later on, I net those out for us to see what the real impact is of other items here in the forecast. But I just want you to know that when you see a bump in other sources and other uses, that's the revenue and expense side of these advances going back and forth between the ESSER fund and the general fund. On the expenditure side, in personnel, I included the recently agreed to 4% increase with CEA. You have a Me Too clause with the other large union here, OPSI. So I went across the board with 4%. I believe you're currently in negotiations with a newly formed union, and then you have 2 other associations for classified supervisors and administrators. CEA and OPSI are the lion's share. So I just put in 4% across the board as an assumption here for the years through fiscal year 25. The next assumption I made was that after that there would be a 2.5% base increase for all groups. It used to be I had in 1%. Because this forecast is a precursor to levy planning, I thought the 1% was not a reasonable assumption, that we should be factor in and size the levy at least at a plus 2.5% for those outlying years. Subject to our discussion. You could leave it alone, you could make it less, you could make it more. What actually happens is subject to collective bargaining, but this for me is for levy planning purposes. What do we need to plan for? This is one of those variables, like several others, that you have the opportunity to make one of two kind of errors. You plan on it being 2.5 and it's more, so that's not good for cash balance, or you plan for 2.5 and it's less. Okay, well that's pretty good. So which side of that on the expenditure side do you want to be? Do you want to tend to, I'll say, be more generous in those expenditure estimates so that hopefully you come in under? And that would be a reverse argument on the revenue side when we talk about state funding. If you count on state funding coming through and being phased in and it doesn't, that's a different problem than not counting on it being phased in, and it does. So just kind of the type 1, type 2 errors. We have a 5-year staffing plan. We're actually in year 2 of that. It's about 149 additional FTE spread out over the next 4 years. That's continued to be in. And the latest number I received about ESSER funding was 88 positions, primarily safety and security and custodial, that will be planned to come from ESSER funding over to general fund funding. So those would be a net new positions into the general fund of 88 in fiscal year 25 because ESSER runs out during fiscal 24. We have 3 days of Wellness Week, the week of Thanksgiving, and here in the last year we charged that expense to ESSER. We plan on doing it again this year, and I assumed that we would do it again in fiscal 24. So and that's about $7.5 million a year, probably be a little bit more in the other years, but that's what we factored in. Again, end-of-year advances to ESSER. This is the expenditure side of the revenue item that I mentioned earlier. And lastly, capital budget funding. As you know, earlier this year, Alex, who runs our capital projects, did a presentation to the committee about his budget, and he requested, I think it was $40 million and change. $4.1 million we transferred from the general fund to a PI fund back in fiscal 22 before it closed. And then 36.6 was transferred this year into that fund. So we have to answer the question, how are we going to do capital funding? I proposed here that it come from the general fund in the amount of $40 million per year. And it just continues so that we would use general fund monies to fund it. If you can recall, we had a PI levy and a bond issue on the ballot. The PI levy was to do this type of work. This $40 million transfer is not for the FMP work. That's a bond issue. It was a proposed $680 million bond issue. And I know I wrote the numbers down, and I'm trying to remember where I put my note, and I can't find my note. It was 2.93 mils to fund $680 million, and we put on a 4.7 mil PI levy. It was going to generate around $55 million a year. If you recall, I put together a 25-year plan, starting with $48 million need that Alex identified, and I simply inflated that 2% a year over 25 years, got an average, figured out what we need in millage, and that's where we came up with 4.7 mils. So we had a 7.63 mil scheduled for the November levy, and the board made the decision last August to pull it off the ballot. So there's no alternative source for capital funding currently on deck. I put the capital budget in here in the general fund. This is an option we're going to have to talk about. You want it in, you want it out, you want it in for a smaller amount, whatever you whatever you want to do. I kind of feel like this was one of the few forecasts where, unlike when I typically come in and say, here are my assumptions, here it is, and generally everybody goes, okay, that's fine. But here it's a little bit more of an a la carte. I'm going to propose questions to you, and you're going to get to, build your own forecast, if you will, as we go along. All right. As a result of all of this, this is what our cash balances look like for this November forecast. This is the blue lines, the actual cash. The reserved cash balance is less what we need for 60 to hold in reserve for 60 days expenditures. A couple of takeaways from here. Fiscal 24 is the first year that our unreserved cash goes negative. So that means we don't meet that cash balance target. The second takeaway here is fiscal 25. That's the first year we go negative. Now, that's important because that's the second year of this forecast, and this will impact decision-making. This will impact our behavior. You have additional negotiations in the spring. I can't sign a collective bargaining agreement that extends into fiscal 25 because I'm negative. There are some long-term service contracts we may want to enter into that, unless we kind of jump through some hoops about a longer-term contract is cheaper than 5 one-year contracts. You can work with that, but generally speaking, it restricts the long-term obligations you can get into. So that's something we have to consider, and why I want you to talk about these assumptions and see if it can be reasonable to say, you know what, we're not going to plan on doing this. We can improve that balance, and we won't face the issue of a negative balance in 25. The good news for this is, absent what I just talked about, signing contracts, you know, you're not deciding on a levy tonight. You know, if you're talking about, I'm assuming a levy in 24, that's another point of discussion that we can get into. But from my perspective, when I think about a levy in 24, it's good that we start talking about it. It's good that you see the millage impact of some of these assumptions and the millage impact of these trends. And then as we get to next spring and hear about the state, see how we're actually doing on expenditures this year, we'll get a better picture. But this time next year, you're going to have to do some really serious decision-making about the operating levy you want to put on the ballot in November of 24. So that's the timing picture that's going on in my head as I prepared all this. And lastly, this is the end of the forecast. So the forecast that we'll submit to ODE will show a $430 million cash deficit in fiscal year 27. Were we to submit this forecast to ODE, I'm pretty sure we'll get a nastygram from them telling us that we need to have, what's our plan to not have a deficit in 24? What's our plan to eliminate that? But we can work on these assumptions, and if we can change them reasonably and avoid that, that would be great. And I just want to point out that this graph is in millions of dollars. So yes, on the far right-hand side, that's $2 billion that you're looking at with a B in terms of that downward trend. Some highlights of differences between May and November. When do we start to deficit spend? That is, expenditures exceed revenues. Well, except for fiscal 24 in May, each one of the years in that forecast, 21, 23 through 26, they were all expenditures exceeded revenues. What happened now with November when we update these assumptions, 22, we're deficit spending in every year of the forecast, from 21 out to 26. So we're eating into cash balance all during the forecast. Reserved cash balance, in May, we showed a reserved cash balance negative in fiscal 26, which was the last year of the forecast. This time, it showed up in 24, and we remained negative for reserved cash balance throughout the forecast. And then the actual cash going negative, in May, we didn't have one. We didn't have a negative cash. We had one in the next year outside of that, but we didn't have one in the forecast. And this time, it shows up in 25. In essence, the negative cash balances, reserved or actual, have moved 2 years closer. So the revised assumptions that I showed you up there about state aid and personnel and the transfer for capital have caused that deficit to move in 2 years closer. Let's talk about some changes. I may have mentioned some, but I'll go over them in line by line and in a little bit greater detail.
Can I just stop right here for a quick second? I just want to ask if any of you have any questions to this point right now. Maybe even questions that he'll answer as we move further in this presentation. But I just want to get a sense of where everybody is right now. So you all understand our drivers. You all understand what it is that we're taking into serious consideration moving forward. Okay.
One quick question.
Yes.
The declining enrollment, is that declining enrollment as a percent of all the students in the state of Ohio, public school students in the state of Ohio? Or is the entire population in the state of Ohio declining, or just our percentage of that?
I don't know the answer to that.
So we know that our numbers are declining, but is the allocation the same? We're just going to receive less because we don't have as many students, or how do we know, I guess?
Well, because the formula is, it's a multiplication problem. It is driven by actual enrollment that we report. So it's our enrollment, irrespective of what else is going on in the state. It's our enrollment that we report to the state that is then multiplied by various categories and various dollar amounts, and then all of that's multiplied by the state share index to give us what the state will pay us for those various categories. But it's our enrollment.
No relationship to the rest of the enrollment?
No.
No, this standardized, as a formula, is standardized, but it's much more localized to any given district of the 600 plus in the state of Ohio. Yeah.
There's an odd little interplay going on that I don't totally understand, and if Matt does, he'll explain it. But the idea, one of the ideas in the formula was in the previous mechanism, some of our indicators were relative to where we fell within the state. We wanted to try and eliminate that so that we were just judged on where we were. I think the wealth factor does somewhat confound that. So it is how wealthy are we and kind of relative to other districts. So that kind of, I remember I made a rather snide and sarcastic comment during a meeting once to Representative ODE about I thought we weren't going to get penalized how we fell relative to other districts. But there is a bit of that in there. But far and away, this is all driven by local issues and local numbers. Okay? All right, as the graphs as I go forward, I did a little combo graph for us. And just so you know, the designation of LHS is for those items that are being plotted on the left-hand scale versus the right-hand scale. So the absolute numbers are all on the left-hand scale. The change numbers on the right-hand scale. So you could see the relative magnitude of what I'll be talking about. Looking at property taxes, and this again changes from May, essentially none. I mean, you can see a dip in 23, and that's a little negative, and then in 26 it's positive. And that has to do with, as we plot out actual receipts, settlement period by settlement period, sometimes it'll shift from fiscal year to fiscal year a bit, but essentially unchanged from May. I add trend lines here that you can probably not even see the blue trend line for the blue bars or May forecast and the orange trend line. That's because they're essentially the same. In May, we were looking at a compound annual growth rate of about 2.24%. And this November, when I put it together, we're looking at a compound rate of about 2.38%. So essentially the same rate of growth year over year.
Dan, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So this goes back to the formula you were just talking about, part of the wealth of the community. And so, you know, we understand that in that formula, it believes that our local district is more wealthy than we said. But I don't see that in the property tax pull-in. Can you talk about that?
The way you see wealth in your property tax is whether or not your electorate passes a new operating levy. That's where the wealth factor comes in. So they might say we're wealthy, but if our electorate decides they can't afford that, that's, you know, telling us that we're more wealthy doesn't help.
Right. But that's how they decide how much money we get.
Right, and so the expectation is if your state share goes down, the expectation is you would generate the dollars locally to make up for that, or you contribute a larger share to the cost of education, and the only way we contribute to the cost of education is through property taxes.
The dissonance of the game.
Yes.
It really is. I mean, so we're not even allowed to, in a 5-year forecast, assume that we would have to go on a ballot or not. We're not allowed to make that assumption in a 5-year forecast at all.
No, sir.
But they can. It's just interesting to me. I just, you know, it's just very interesting to me, the paradox. But thank you.
Yep. And this is all, you remember that I usually have that thing about the purpose of the forecast. The purpose of the forecast is this, is to precipitate a discussion and understanding of the variables and the risks that we face and what's reasonable. And when we look out into the future, what is a reasonable expectation of what's going to happen? And given what we think might happen, do we have to do something today in reaction to that? So we'll talk about some options on there. The next large revenue source is state aid, and you can see here that the change line, the black line, goes substantially negative, and that is the $15 million a year in the transportation penalty and the declining state aid due to enrollment and state share index. Okay. In May, we had predicted pretty flat state aid. It was a whopping 0.39% annual growth rate from 22 to 26. Now we're at a negative growth rate. That downward sloping trend line is about 3.5% annual drop in state aid.
Plus it includes the 15 million.
Yeah, and the 15 million confounds that percentage. If we didn't include the 15 million, what are we looking at, you think? Are we in that 1 to 2% range because of enrollment? So the major contributing factor here is that 15 million transportation penalty. But we will, go ahead.
No, I'll let you finish.
I was just going to say, we will have a declining state aid, though, but it'll be much smaller. Pardon me?
The $15 million penalty that you're projecting, how long is that to be?
I put it in ad infinitum.
Ongoing.
As long as they think we're violating it.
Yeah.
Ongoing.
So
So either the penalty calculation changes, it goes away, or we somehow become compliant.
Okay.
I put it in as if it's going to be there forever.
So that's the way you have to do it.
Okay? I then grouped together all other local revenues, and compared to May, there's no change.
So just so the listening public, and I really like to really speak to the listening public, in these types of settings, but I think it's really important for them to understand that we're taking into account an ongoing loss. We've already had to account for our pilots being phased out over time that could have very viably captured that $15 million penalty if we got it. Those costs could have captured that. But here we are, we're constantly, year after year, biennial budget after legislation passed, having to consider ongoing loss. We've lost pilots. Not only do we lose the revenue, we lost the opportunity to even have our day in court to get that revenue back, let alone a new assessment on whatever this ambiguous formula is to even account for a transportation violation. So I just want folks to understand that you hear these numbers like 2 billion or whatever the number is, but when you're counting constantly year after year for ongoing losses on nebulous stuff, I'm not trying to lecture, I promise, but this is just too much. It really is. I'm just really livid. I really am right now.
And
thank you.
You've identified what I call as a tax on public school funding.
a tax on urban school funding.
Okay, I'll go with that too.
Because the transportation problem is ours alone, really, in this county. And we are shouldered with that, required to transport all students, whether they are ours or not. And that is something that our legislature has decided. And so what, Chair Cole is saying is that it is absolutely unfair, and even the ability to go and get the property tax that we deserve, we are limited, which means we cannot educate our students. All designed by our legislature.
Thank you.
And, we are trying our best. We are fighting this. We are doing all that we can do because we don't want the penalty. We want to be compliant, We want to transport and do what we're supposed to do. We want children to go to school in this county. But on the finance side, we have to take this into account. Things that we cannot control. And there could be more coming ahead. We don't know. But, that's the thing when people say, oh, you have this big budget. You have all this money. How could you not? This is why. It is set up to do this to us.
And you just pointed out something that I failed to mention when I showed the resulting cash balance graph, and we'll get a look at it again. But heretofore, I think many districts across the state build a cash balance as a result of the COVID years. And we were being criticized for carrying such a large cash balance. So here we are in November of 22, not long after, I don't know, can we say the end of COVID? I mean, we're back to more normal operations. Here we are in November of 22, and that cash balance is gone by fiscal 25. So all that I and my counterparts said in terms of why you need a cash balance build over time, it's here. Tonight, I'm telling you, you're going to burn through that cash balance. And then this is other financing sources. On the revenue side, as I said, this is that bump is the $79 million for the ESSER advances coming back. So when we look at total revenues, you can see that that $79 million activity, which is temporary, really distorts the changes from May. But you can see in May we were in total revenues looking at about a 1.25% annual growth rate. Now in November, about 0.76, and that 0.76 really factors out that aberration because of those advances. And so it just shows you that decline in state revenue has really slowed down any total revenue growth that we're projecting. Just to draw your attention graphically to what the sources of change are, it's pretty clear here that it's other financing sources and it's state aid. One's positive, one's negative, and I just wanted to point that out so you can see it. And let's move on to the expenditure side. Here's personnel. You can see in the change line there's a spike in that line in 25 when additional personnel comes in. You can see that the trend line, the orange trend line, is steeper than the blue trend line. We changed the assumptions. We're at plus 4%, and we're at plus 2.5%. So in May, that annual growth rate from 22 to 26 was about 3.62%. Now in November, from 22 out to 27, the annual growth rate is 5.8%. So that has changed the picture of the growth in personnel costs. Looking at non-personnel, one of the things that Matt did was he went and he looked at the budgets and he adjusted them downward based upon historical spend trends. We did pick up a bit. You can see there that that change line is just slightly negative, not terribly monumental. And remember here too that we're looking at a budget line that's in that 120 to 150 million dollar amount rather than like personnel that's over 400 million. Okay, so the magnitude here is a little bit different. In May, we had about a 7.76 projected annual growth rate. Now in November, it's down about 1.5% to 6.25% annual growth rate. You could change this. We can go back in and modify it and say, well, let's assume they're going to spend even less. There's not enough here to have a material impact on the forecast. So I want to make sure you know that the catch is worth the chase here. Look at debt service. No change from May because debt service is what debt service would be. I just pulled that out. And for other financing sources, here you can see that there's a jump in 22. As those advances go out, they continue in 23, and in 23 you add to that the 36 for capital. In 24, you've got 40 for capital and 76 or 79, whatever it is, going out. But in 25, all you have is capital. That's why it drops back down. Total expenditures, you can see the distortion that the advances create, but here the trend line has not only slightly increased in slope, it has also moved up fairly dramatically versus May. Again, looking at sources of change on the expenditure side, this is just to highlight again, other financing uses which we weren't aware of in May, we are now, and then the blue is personnel because of a change in our assumptions. Let's look at changes in ending cash balance. You clearly see that those changes have all resulted in a negative impact on cash balance. I've always said that downward sloping trend line is not sustainable, and if the blue one isn't, the orange one sure as heck isn't. And you see that there's the 25 negative cash balance. Examining the changes to the cash balance, what has impacted cash balance? On the revenue side, we actually had some positive impact, but that was all transitory. That was all the advance activity. And you see in 26 that it's negative because of the drop in state aid. On the expenditure side, you can see that it's all negative. Let's break that down into greater factors here in a minute. But when I do it on a cumulative basis, the overall net change, revenue side contributed about 138 by the end of the forecast to increase the cash balance. But on the expenditure side, and is almost 500 million negative. So they'll net out, what is that, about 330 million down in cash balance in FY26. Getting into the components of that change, the orange bars at the top, that's other financing sources. The, I'll say, darker blue that begin in fiscal 22, those are other financing uses. So if you look at the orange and the blue, they kind of offset one another. I'll show you that in a minute. But then the lighter blue is the impact of state aid being declining, and then the yellow bars are where the personnel expenditures kick in to cause cash balance go down. When I combine all the other revenues and all the other expenditures, you don't even see them on the graph here. The point of this is to highlight what areas should we be looking at. So what I've done here is I pulled two of them out, just other financing sources and uses, the advances and transfers. And you can see 75 goes out, 79 comes back in, 79 out, 79 in, 119 out in 24, which is 79 plus 40 for the capital, and 79 comes back in 25, but nothing goes out for advances. And so you can see how they kind of seesaw back and forth, and they, in essence, become cash balance neutral. And the residual is just the 40 million that's being transferred to the capital fund. When I look at the cumulative sources of change, you can see that they tend to almost offset themselves at the end of the day. But the difference is what? 120 million, and that's 3 years of $40 million going out the door. And I actually do that calculation here, the cumulative sources, each year added together. So the other sources and uses contributed to about $117 million decline in cash balance, and that's literally 3 years of the capital budget being funded for 24, 25, and 26. All right? Taking all my other sources of revenue and expenditures, state aid, the remainder of revenues, personnel, and other expenditures, you can see that it's just state aid and personnel that contribute. And on a cumulative basis, those all add up to 212 million in terms of the negative impact on cash balance. So when we put them together, just looking at the source of the impact, if you look at FY26, 212 of it come from those items that aren't other sources and uses. And those big ones, as you saw before, those main contributors before, were state aid and personnel, all right? And then the orange bar, which is 117, is the transfers. So we really have only three areas here that are having the biggest impact on that change in cash balance. So here's that cash balance graph I was referring you to. This is what it looks like, May versus November. So while back in the end of fiscal 21, everybody was saying, well, you have $283 million, what's your problem? And the end of fiscal 21 was 15 months ago. Why I said 283 is easily evaporated. Here's your picture. So some decision points or discussion points, if you will, that we can get into today. I have 3 additional scenarios to run by you very quickly and show you the impact both in terms of balances and millage impact, assuming a 24 levy, and I believe the target is fiscal 29 to get back into the black. State aid, what are we going to assume about the phase into the formula? What are we going to do with the $15 million assumption about transportation penalty? In personnel, is 2.5% in the out years appropriate? And what are we doing with the positions in ESSER? Then lastly, capital budget. We're going to fund a capital budget through the general fund, or are we going to not do it in the general fund and wait to see when we put a PI levy on? And I'm not even talking about FMP at this point. I'm talking about that life cycle replacement PI levy that we had on the ballot. The current assumptions, as a reminder, are that we don't get fully funded. We include the $15 million a year penalty. The 2.5% in the out years seems reasonable and is appropriate. That we are going to bring 88 safety and security and custodial positions from ESSER over to the general fund. And that we will do the capital budget at $40 million a year. And you saw that graph. That the result of that was that graph that fell off the table. So as we sat, Eric and I and Matt said, well, let's look at some alternative assumptions. Let's, can we make this anyway a little bit rosier picture, a little bit more palatable? So the first crack at it that we did, and these are in no particular order, you're going to see how we went through an iterative process of, well, I wonder what this looks like, and does this seem reasonable? And then we look at it and we go, oh, I don't like that. And we go to the next one, and then we get to a point where we go, I think Eric calls option 2 Pollyanna, and we go, well, Pollyanna isn't going to work. That's too aggressive. And then we get to option 3. So I want to walk you through our thinking and our iteration, as crazy as it might seem. So for revised assumptions 1, we're going to go with fully funded state aid, and we're not going to include the transportation penalty. In other words, hey, we're going to get funded from the state. We're not going to get penalized. Let's say that that's going to happen. On the personnel side, no change. Yep, 2.5 is good to assume, and 88 people are coming back over. 88 FTE are coming over. And, I look at capital budget funding as kind of a low-hanging fruit. Let's take it out. Low-hanging because guess what? You don't have a capital budget now. So taking it out doesn't mean we change our behavior. It ought to make you tap the brakes at a board meeting when you talk excited about, all the capital improvements you're doing. I might suggest you tap the brakes on that discussion a little bit because you don't have funding for it. But taking it out is kind of status quo. So what's that do for us? So this is the current assumption, how it looks, both reserved and, actual cash. And it changes to this. Here are what the arrows mean. Here in 24, we're better, but we're still negative. We're still negative on unreserved cash in 24. In 25, we're better, and we've gone positive. So we've accomplished that. And in 27, the end of the forecast, we're still negative, but we're not as negative as much, as you would assume would happen. This behaved exactly as we thought. We just didn't know the magnitude, and there's the magnitude. In this table, which I'm going to add to it as we go through each scenario, this table can really be the kind of the crux of our conversation. This is what it takes under the current assumptions and under the revised assumptions, number one, to get FY29 positive with a November 24 operating levy. The boxes I have on here, in FY25, I've boxed the 81 and the 182 because that's the first year that the new levy proceeds are received. So you're voting in November of 24, which is in the middle of fiscal 25, and you will get a half-year collection in that fiscal year. I boxed in FY29 because when you vote in 24 and assume a 4-year levy cycle, voting in 24 is not for fiscal year 25, it's for fiscal years 26, 27, 28, and 29. So those are the key points to look at and how we get there. So you can see that if we change the assumptions and say, well, let's assume that we're going to get fully funded and we're not going to have the transportation penalty and we're not going to do capital funding, you can get away with 9.2 mils in November of 24. We thought, well, that probably isn't terribly palatable, even at that level. So we went on to a second set of assumptions. Our revised assumptions, too, leaves the state aid assumption alone, fully funded and no transportation penalty. And let's look at personnel and go, you know what, let's go back to Stan's original assumption historically, and let's do 1%. And let's say, you know, we're going to have to bring those positions over on a net zero basis through attrition or something else. But you can't do a net positive add of ESSER positions coming over. So I put those positions at 0. And again, we left out capital funding. So as a comparison, the blue line is our original assumption for cash balance. The orange got a little bit better, and the gray got slightly better, which is revised number 2. What's that do to millage? You can see, well, we get it down to 7.2 mils in 24. Now, don't know that we have a millage cap. I know in 2016 there was some desire not to be above 7 mils in a request. We clearly were above that for our capital request, but you know, I don't know what that barrier might be. We all felt that this is the Pollyanna set of assumptions, to assume that we're going to get what we, I'll say, deserve from the state. I think kind of underestimate payroll increases, salary increases in the future, and then we're going to, you know, not bring over any net new positions out of ESSER. We're still doing spending plan, you know, the personnel plan for 5 years. Those positions, that 149 positions, they're still in there, but no ESSER positions, and we're going to have to find another way to fund capital. So we got it down to 7.2 mils, but we thought, well, that's probably not what I would recommend be ultimately approved. So we went to option 3. For option 3, we went back to the originals and say, what are we going to leave alone? So we're going to leave state funding alone. I hate to say that I don't trust the General Assembly, but I don't want to count my chickens before count my chickens before my eggs are hatched? Is that the way to, whatever that saying is? I don't want to do that. I'm also going to assume that we're going to get penalized. Those are the two most conservative assumptions. I think 2.5 is a reasonable assumption, so we left that in. And I think because I believe that there is a pretty good rationale, commitment, desire, whatever, to bring those 88 positions over. But that's it. There's a lot more positions in ESSER than 88. So whatever happens to them, in this forecast, they have to be net funded into general fund at 0. And then capital budget, you're going to have to figure that out. So the only thing we took out from the original assumption, let's take out the capital budget and see what happens. Now the picture, we finally got to my infamous hurricane map. And I know that's a bad analogy because we just had a hurricane. And when I was doing this presentation in my office, I said, oh, look, here's Naples and here's Tampa. You know, you don't know where it's coming in, but what I do know is she's coming ashore, she or he. I guess we give hurricanes male names now too. It's coming ashore somewhere in that range. But look, assumption 3, a little bit better than the original. And what we took out was the capital, which seems to be an okay thing to me to do if you so choose to. What you gain, though, is that positive cash balance in 25, even though 26 is negative. What's it do to levies? We've gone from 16.7 down to 12.5. So we, saved 4.2 mils. Interesting. The capital funding, 40 million, saved 4.2 mils. The PI levy was 4.7 mils, generating more money, but it was a 25-year plan. So it was on average over time because PI levy dollars are fixed over time. So it all works out. Kind of do it one way or the other. You can either put the millage in operating or you can put the millage in PI, but that gives you a pretty good picture. So I think we can bring these charts back up whenever you want to look at them, but I would close with reminding you these are the decision points I think we need to make so that we modify the 5-year forecast either as I take it to the board, or I can take it to the board and see if they concur with your recommendation to make changes, whatever you want to do. But this is a time where this is still very iterative and very participative in terms of developing the 5-year forecast. State aid, personnel, capital budget funding. What do you think we ought to do? Longer term, which are kind of non-5-year forecast prep, what do we want to assume about an operating levy? We've got a spreadsheet built. We'll put an operating levy in 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. We can do that. But as you know, the longer you wait, the larger the millage. The more early you address it, the lower the millage. We ran a scenario of 23, but also having that solve just 29, not 28, which if you move it a year, it should be. We just said, well, let's solve 28. You save, I forget, we get down to about 8 mils, I think, in 23. So it's still pretty high millage. So when do you want to go? How much is there? Cap on what we can ask for? Because if you all or the board says to me, look, we're not putting anything above 7.5 mils. Well, then that becomes a fixed point in what I have now as a variable, and you back into that. So you either change those assumptions or you add an assumption that we haven't put in yet. That is expenditure reductions. You got to go into your budget, go into your programs, go into your operations, and make cuts. You can assume that, but you need to execute it on it. And again, the sooner you do it, the better. And you have to make cuts that in 1 year last forever. You don't bring them back until you have funding for it. So this is, if you ever wanted to get in the weeds of preparing a 5-year forecast, welcome. We can do that. And then lastly, staffing. What do we want to do with? I just did operating levy, capital funding. When PI bond? When do you want to do that? How much can you stand to put on the ballot at one time? How often can you stand to be on the ballot? And then staffing. Maybe we're not ready to make a complete decision about staffing relative to those ESSER positions. But it expires in 24. And you're going to be going on the ballot. I think this discussion a year from now is going to be really hot. If this one isn't hot now, it's going to be extremely hot next November, and we're going to need decisions about that.
Are there any questions at this point?
That concludes my presentation. I'm looking forward to your guidance. What do you think?
Thank you so much, Mr. Treasurer, for this presentation. Are there any questions? On screen, do we have any questions?
Can I say something before?
Okay.
And I'm going to let the committee members talk before I, as the board president, because I want to hear you. But I just, want to say this. you know, we talk about the numbers, and we saw the scary chart that goes down, and people might say, there you go again, CCS, you don't know how to manage your money. But here's the thing, that's not true. And that's what this forecasting is all about. And the reason why those went down is because we have made strategic decisions about the investments in our children. We know that a large part of our district, of our budget, is around money that pay our staff. We know we cannot do our mission without our staff. And we know that in order to maintain and retain our talented staff, we have to be competitive. And so these are strategic decisions that the board has made and we made in this past negotiation. And we also heard that our community supported these things, loud and clear. We also have heard that our community supports us maintaining and upgrading our buildings, loud and clear. And that's something that's different between May and today. And so this isn't about any type of mismanagement. This is actually about doing the things that we need to do to ensure our students have what they need to become the portrait of a graduate. And we are listening to our community. And the whole idea about how schools are funded and things that are done to us and strategic decisions we need to make for our kids, it's all wrapped up into why these charts look the way they do. And then when we then turn around on the financial side of this and look at these charts and figuring out, you know, because as to be responsible for all the taxpayer money, we also don't want huge balances, right? And we don't want to come too low. We want to stay in that middle, and we've made strategic decisions as a district to keep cash balance because that's just smart. That's just smart for emergency purposes. And so we see the scary number, we see it go down, but you have to look at it a little bit more holistically. And I'm just reminding everyone to look at it, the community, not these smart professional financial people, they get it. But when we see these things, because we are a large district, we talk about large amounts of money. But in reality, these are all decisions that we are making very strategically to ensure that our children have the things that they need, the people they need in order to learn at maximum capacity. And I just felt like I need to say that before I now listen to the very smart professional finance people on ideas about what we should do. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Green.
So back to the penalty, is there any way to mitigate that penalty? Or can that go away? I know it's on the budget and it has to be forever, but how do you fix that or solve it from a transportation? It was a transportation issue,
It's
right?
a transportation penalty, yeah.
So is there a way to fix whatever the problem was so that yeah.
So that's it's a great question. It's an ongoing issue. So one of the things that we're working diligently to remediate this situation, one, is continuing the constant hire and training of staff to be able to actually meet our requirement. Two,
I guess my question would be, what is the penalty? How do we get the penalty?
The penalty is because we are accused of not transporting the charter non-public students. We're late and not providing the services we're supposed to under the law.
Can we give you
Yeah, go ahead.
It's persistent and consistent, I think is the phraseology. And we are non-compliant in a particular day. I think there's a 30-minute window to drop off or pick up. Correct. So if we don't do that for so many days in a row or so many days in a semester, and that school complains or the parent complains about that, ODE reports that to us. I hope there's an investigation to make sure the date is correct, but then that's how we're declared non-compliant for those so many days. The calculation is the transportation subsidy, which for us is about $29 million, divided by 180 school days. Don't know how that was derived, but that's how the calculation works. So were we deemed non-compliant on a persistent and consistent basis for 180 days, we could lose all $30 million. I think it's highly unlikely that that would happen. But that's where we're caught. We miss a pickup entirely in a day. We're 5 or 10 minutes late outside that 30-minute window.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, and I told you we filed a lawsuit. I was deposed. I testified. What's egregious about the penalty, other than the fact that the rule was promulgated inappropriately, they didn't go through the right process. Notwithstanding that, the calculation is pretty egregious. We miss one student on one stop at one school for the required number of days in a row, and let's say it's 10, they take 1/180th of that total subsidy times 10 as the penalty, one student. During a conversation with ODE about this last fall, I posed the question, what if I didn't pick up any of them for that 10-day period? What's the penalty? Dead silence for a little while, and their attorney responded the same. Does that make any sense to anybody? Coupled with the fact that we never got to say anything about the calculation of the penalty or the rule or anything like that. All that notwithstanding, that actual calculation, you miss one kid, it's one, I think it was, how many 100,000 a day? 600,000? I don't know, somebody real quick divide 29 million by 180. Whatever that is, it's the same whether I miss one kid or 1,000 kids. I miss one route or I miss them all. Because one day is one day.
Right.
$61,000. Huh? $161,000 a day. I miss one kid or I miss 10,000. It just, that doesn't make sense to me. But your question about is there a way to mitigate it? And that's a bus driver supply issue. You know,
What I was looking to answer at that very moment, it really is. There's a question. Katie, you have a question?
You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Oh, am I?
There you go.
Am I unmuted now? Oh, thank you.
You are.
Thank you. Just to clarify, is there any sort of consideration given if the reason why a student wasn't picked up or missed that 30-minute window, it's because, you know, there aren't bus drivers available? Because I know that's been a big issue for all schools, right? So is that given consideration?
I believe the correct answer to that is no. But Dr. James is, I think, online if he wanted to correct me, but I believe the answer to that is no. There's you either
no, you're correct. There's no consideration for the lack of bus drivers. For us to get back to being able to provide that service level for everyone, we probably need about 150 bus drivers every day, extra, more than what we have. We're probably down 100 routes that we can't cover on a daily basis.
So all schools are being penalized the same thing then?
All schools?
Well,
They are.
Everyone's having the same issue.
All schools are.
Everybody who can't transport would have the same thing.
Hang on. All schools are subject to that rule.
Right.
Whether or not all schools are penalized
that's something
depends upon complaints filed by charter non-pubs and or their parents. So there can be in the state districts that don't comply, but they're non-public, I'm sorry, I said non-pubs, that's non-public schools. The charter non-public schools either don't complain, perhaps don't know that they should complain. I don't know why you should, but anyway. So they're all subject to it, but they're not all impacted by the penalty. Do you know how many school districts there were?
Us and 3 other districts last year.
Us and 3 other districts last year. It's probably a few more this year, but it's not 600. And what's interesting, we're often asked, where does the penalty go? Penalty goes back to the state. So there's no monetary benefit that I know of to a charter non-pub to file a complaint. It is simply punitive to us, and sort of in a warped, I don't know if this is what they believe, but it's rather warped thinking that if we miss picking up kids, that the way to get us to comply is to cut the funds available to actually get a bus driver and a bus and get out there in a timely fashion to pick up the kid. This whole logic doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, you know, that old saying that the floggings will continue until the morale improves. You know, we're going to try and cut you into greatness. Well, you don't cut anything into greatness. We have a practical supply problem in terms of bus drivers that make it impossible to complete those routes. And somewhere in the legislature, they decided to add this penalty, believing that, well, if you don't do that, we'll penalize you. And it's disproportionate. It's disproportionate. Just, you got cranked up about one thing, I get cranked up about
No, no worries. I appreciate the clarity.
Yeah.
Did somebody raise their hand back there? Okay, no worries. Are there any additional questions? Again, I think another thing that we definitely want to take in consideration, going back to that 2.5% consideration per annum, where we're costing out really more on the personnel side what that impact can be. I know that a lot of our economists today are talking about a recession quite possibly as early next year. So inflation, recession are some other things that, as we are ongoing in our planning about this whole piece, that we have to take under serious consideration as well. We're going to have to absorb additional costs, quite honestly, that we may not even be thinking about. I hope that that is not the case, but again, these are some ongoing assumptions that we're also trying to take under consideration. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Traylor.
My question is, as I back up here for a minute, does the committee individually, collectively, want to give me some guidance on what you believe either the original assumptions or options 1, 2, or 3 in terms of if you were to adopt a 5-year forecast tonight, which one of those would you be most comfortable with? Or is there a modification to one of those that you would want the board to consider adopting? Just kind of curious your reactions. As I said, this is your chance to kind of get in the weeds and participate in what would those assumptions be?
My thing would be, I don't know how we can cut that much out of the capital budget funding. I mean, I know it helps us if we cut it, but does that make sense?
Mr. Brown, I think you were trying to get in.
Yes, thank you. And like Jennifer indicated when she spoke, I didn't want to jump ahead of hearing from our committee members and unduly influence anything. And I will also suggest that my comments are very tentative. I want to continue to listen and hear and study this before I reach any conclusions. But I wanted to provide at least my impressions right now. And it would be helpful to me if you could put the slide back on that had that the breakdown of the questions. But I think we do need to, yeah, that's the one. Thank you. I think we do need to assume that we're not going to get this, that the state funding is going to decline. I don't think there's any way not to do that on our, and be responsible. I think we also, yes, I know that the litigation will end at some point and that the transportation penalty will end at some point, and I have no idea how that's going to go, but until that happens, and that could be, years off, I think we have to build that penalty into our assumptions. With respect to personnel, I could very easily be convinced that we have to go higher than 2.5% for purposes of this 5-year plan. But seeing what it does to the numbers bothers me. And we have to keep some reasonableness about this, especially to keep the millage down when we do go on the ballot. I don't like the assumption of going back to 1%, but I think that 2.5% is probably a reasonable place to be at this point. The positions funded by ESSER, as I understand it, I think that those were positions intended to be limited positions based upon the funding source. And we knew that the funding source was not going to be in perpetuity or anything like it. So I think that we can make the hard decision that some of those positions may not continue if we don't have the funding for them. With respect to the capital budget, I think that it is absolutely essential that we fund that type of maintenance that keeps us from getting back in the hole with a lot of maintenance deferred. I think we must keep up with plans that we've created about servicing things on an ongoing basis. I'd much prefer that funding come from a PI levy, strongly prefer that it come from a PI levy, but I think that we really have to do the work on an ongoing basis regardless. So until we can pass a PI levy, I would support keeping that funding in our assumption for the 5 years. How much of that? I think it needs to be the amount that's required based on our repair and maintenance schedules. And that's going to be, very much, I think the numbers that were mentioned earlier, perhaps not as much as the last PI levy that we considered might have reached, but at least enough to fund work. So, all of that together says that we need to be on the conservative side and be thinking that we're going to need higher numbers than we'd like for the next several levies.
Mr. Chair, I absolutely agree with Board Member Brown about the state aid and the assumption on the transportation penalty. I think those are two items that I've been around the business long enough to know that you can never predict what the General Assembly is going to do beyond that 2-year period. So I think that is a wise move. And while I agree with that 2.5% might not be exactly right, I think it's probably the best. That's probably the best number. The funded positions, I think this is always the risk that you have whenever you fund positions with short duration, and I kind of short in its quotes, but limited time frame money. And I think that's an unfortunate thing because I can see that there is a need that has legs to do this. But it would seem to me that that's a place that 88 positions is not a huge number in the grand scheme of things. And then I think but I also don't think that we should, the assumption should be 0, I think the unfortunate fact is. And I think from the capital budget funding standpoint, there is no question there is needs for all of those, no question. But given that, I do have to ask myself, is there a middle ground that can be slightly less than 40 that still recognizes that there are high priority things that you don't want to have deferred for a long period of time and dig yourself a hole. That is there not a better place to be other than 40, slightly less than that, that gets you not necessarily the best spot, but it's maybe a little bit more palatable.
Mr. Green?
I think I'm leaning.
If I could add one further thought to what I had to say, and that is on the last question that was asked about current expenditures, and at what point do we start tightening our belt? I think that from my perspective, we have to start doing that immediately. I don't think that we can wait a few years and wait for the financial circumstances to look a lot worse before we start tightening our belt. Now, I don't want to eliminate anything that has significant value. I mean, I want to do everything we can for our students and for our staff, but I think we need to take a hard look at things and make decisions that some things are not as worthwhile as others, consider eliminating some of those ongoing expenses.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Green?
The current assumptions that was pointed out in the slides, I agree with the way they're planned out. The $15 million penalty, I would assume that you would have to keep that in the numbers. The personnel at 2.5%. I think that, along with you, that might be the appropriate number. It could be slightly higher, but I would think that for the budget standpoint, I would keep it at the 2.5. And the capital budget funding, the money needs to be in there. The amount, I don't know the amount. I know you have $40 million that you're projecting in there, and so I'm not sure what's higher or lower, but you definitely need to keep money there to keep the capital budget going and trying to make sure that we keep not getting to the hole that we were in previously.
Okay. It sounds like, everybody's on the same page in agreement with, really understanding what our students and our staff need.
So it sounds to me pretty much like the current assumptions with a modification to capital funding. And talked with the capital improvements team and say, well, 40's not it. I need another number.
Need a different number. Yeah.
And have that ready to go for the board presentation. And what was the consensus on the ESSER 88?
That those positions were, it sounded to me as if those positions were likely needed and to be transferable over. So yeah, this should be an assumption that is included.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree that they're needed. I'm just not sure that it's when you have a limited funding period on a grant. This is just one of the risks that happens, that if we can't do it, then we can't do it. I'm not sure that, and please, no, there is no question in my mind that those are needed. It's a simple math question in my head.
So it's the current assumptions with a modification to the capital budget and some discussion around the 88 ESSER positions and saying something to the effect of, if we put them in the plan, is there an alternative to that? Is there another way to net fund it at a lower number?
Or that's exactly where I was going to go. Is 88? I mean, yes, we know that those are the numbers that it is. Can we live with 40? As we all prioritize budgets and we all think about that kind of stuff, is there a number that is less than 88 that maybe makes a little bit of sense in the same way as we're talking about the capital?
And rest assured, we put the plan together. We pick a different number for capital.
Absolutely.
We pick a different number for ESSER, and we file the plan.
Right.
And 6 months from now, we're going to have another discussion because we'll hear about the state. And then 6 months after that, we'll know how 23 came out. And that's when we're really going to have to get down to brass tacks about, is it 88? Is it 400? Is it 10? What is it? And on a capital budget wise, if for some, if perhaps the board has decided that, we see a PI levy in the near future, then we can take that capital funding out in the future years, but leave it in the front end. But that's a modification we can make now. The only thing we're doing now is setting the plan together, the forecast together, under the best set of assumptions that we know now. And know that, as I said, depending upon what fiscal 25, when that first negative cash balance, the only behavioral thing that's going to happen here is when we go negative in cash in the forecast. We won't be able to do certain things. I'll run the numbers, I'll communicate back to you, and I'll share it with the board in 2 weeks. So this is helpful. And I might say, not what I expected.
All right.
So that's I was trying to read tea leaves, and I was close, but not what I expected. But it's good feedback, and I'll make those adjustments. I appreciate it greatly.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Provided there are no additional comments or questions, is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I know this has been a very rich and kind of, in some ways, tough conversation. Again, there's more to come, and I look forward to your continued feedback and support. So thank you very much.